It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. I wish we could meet in person, which has been the norm for many, many years. Let me thank Jeff and Martin for the invitation to be here with you. So I want to start by showing you a little bit life expectancy in the United States. Let's bring that graph up. And so what you can see here is that life expectancy has been increasing in the US, but there's a notable exception, which is 1918. So you see a big decline in life expectancy. I have a bit of a personal connection to this episode because my great-grandmother, Eliza, whom I am told that I met as a baby, she had 11 children. And out of those 11 children, 8 died in the fall of 1918 with the so-called Spanish flu. So only 3 survived. One of them was my grandmother, a very warm person. And I always marveled how warm she was, because she lived through the Great Depression and 2 world wars. But she learned very early on how precious life is. So I'm a macroeconomist. You know, I'm used to worrying about recessions. A lot of people lose their jobs. You know, businesses really suffer during recessions. But this is now an event of another order of magnitude. We really have a fight between life and death. So I thought I would share with you a little bit the model that has been used to produce all these forecasts that you've been seeing. So let's take a look at this SEER model. So this is a model designed in 1927, and all of these forecasts that you've seen have some variant of this model at their core. So let me just briefly explain how the model works, because I think that might be useful. So the model divides the population into 4 groups. And the first group, these people are called susceptible. So that's kind of all of us probably in this call. We don't have immunity to the virus. And the reason this virus was deemed so dangerous, even from the early days, is because no one has immunity. So in the beginning of an epidemic, almost 100% of the population is susceptible. Then there's just, some people get infected. They meet other infected people and they get infected. Once someone is infected, there's 2 exit doors. So one possibility is that this person recovers. And typically when you recover, you acquire immunity to the virus. So that's a happy ending. But there's a tragic ending as well that might be in the cards. Some people die after the infection. And so these are the 4 states that we can travel through. So let me show you briefly the equations of this model, just very briefly. So, S is the number of people who are susceptible, and ST plus 1 is the number of people who are susceptible tomorrow. So you can see it's the number of people that are susceptible today, ST. And then what the model assumes is that people meet randomly. So how many random meetings can we have between susceptibles and infected? Well, that number is ST times IT. So out of these random meetings, a fraction beta results in infection. So a very important feature of epidemics is in the beginning, almost everybody is susceptible, and then we drain the susceptibles. We're going to drain the susceptibles because the susceptibles meet infected people and they become infected. So the second equation shows you the evolution of infected. So it says the infected tomorrow are the infected today, plus the newly infected, the ones that became infected in those cocktail parties or random meetings. And then there's the 2 exit doors, a fraction gamma, that's the green term there, a fraction gamma recovers, and a fraction delta unfortunately dies. So the last 2 equations, this is just accounting. We're going to say the number of people that have recovered tomorrow is the number of people that have recovered today plus the newly recovered. And then the death toll of the epidemic, which unfortunately we can read in the front pages of every newspaper around the globe. Number of people that will have died up to tomorrow is the number of people that have died until today plus the newly deceased. So let's bring up Mrs. Merkel to tell us, what we have to worry about. Angela Merkel, she made a speech on March 11 in which she leveled with the German public. I mean, she's always very straightforward and she's not up for election anyway. So she said to the German public, look, if you don't do anything, the virus is so contagious that between 60 and 70% of the population will end up infected. So now let's take that simple model and let's start an epidemic. So let me show you the simulation. So how do we start it? Let's take a look at the next chart. We're going to start with a very small number of people infected. So, and where did these people come from? Well, perhaps they traveled from another country and brought the infection to our country. But where did the infection originally come from? Well, it comes from a zoonotic, so-called zoonotic infection. There's a virus that managed to jump from animals to humans and then transmit among the human population. And we are having more and more of these zoonotic infections because we as the human race have become hegemonic around the globe, and we are taking larger and larger parts of the globe for ourselves. So that brings us in contact with the species and viruses that we have not encountered before and to which we have no immunity. So whatever, wherever the initial seed came from, what you see here in the blue chart is the draining of the susceptibles. In the beginning, we have almost 100% of the population susceptible, but then these people meet those who are infected and become infected, and so the number of susceptibles falls throughout the episode. You can see these are days, and you can see the episode lasts for about a year. Then take a look at the infected. The infected rise and then they fall. So that's the yellow box right there. Why do they rise initially? Because there's a lot of raw material. There's a lot of susceptible people. So the infected may be few, but they can meet a lot of susceptible people and they create a lot of infections. You see at the peak, 8.5% of the population is infected, and that's going to overwhelm even the most well-prepared healthcare system. So then in the green box, you see the recovered, and then, of course, the red box is the deceased. So let's take a look at the briefing that was given to every government around the world. So these were the numbers that were put on the table. If you want to see the numbers, they were given to prime ministers and presidents. Given the infectiousness of the virus, about 65% of the population will be infected if we do nothing at some point, will be exposed to the virus at some point. At the peak, you're going to have about 8% of the population infected, completely overwhelming hospitals and causing deaths from other diseases because the hospitals won't be able to treat normal patients. For the US, about 2 million dead people, and worldwide about 50 million. So quite a dire scenario. And this, together with the very vivid images we're receiving from China first and then from Italy, this is what prompted a lot of governments into action.
So Sergio, why do we need government intervention, and why can't the private sector take care of this on their own?
Yeah, so this is an important question that Jeff is asking, because you always have to ask, why does the government has to meddle in things? And in this case, the reason government intervention is necessary is because we have what economists call an externality. We are also all familiar with the most common externality, which is pollution. What is an externality? Is me having an impact on you, and this transaction is not priced. I can drive around with my car. I cause some pollution, which will cause some harm to the environment, some harm to my neighbor's health, but I don't pay a price for it. And as a result, I drive around too much, and it's not just me, it's everybody else, right? So we have too much pollution. In the case of infections, perhaps I'm a little feverish, but I need something from the supermarket. Maybe I have an infection, but what's the big deal? I'm going to do a quick run to the supermarket. Then it turns out that I am infected, and I spread the virus to a variety of other people. Once again, I affected the welfare of others, but I don't pay a price for it. So as a result, there's too many people running around spreading the infection. And so we need the government to internalize, to control this externality. And I want to talk a little bit about two ways of doing so. One was the way that was adopted in the West, where we were not very prepared at all to face the epidemic. And the other one that was used in Asia, where they were much better prepared, in great part because they had seen how dangerous these epidemics can be. Because they had SARS in 2003, which was very tough. Then there was Marsh. So they've seen how bad this can be. So let me show you a simulation of a model that I put together with my colleagues. So we'll see in the next slide the charts. Let me flip. Yeah, here we go. So in this slide, what you see is a model that interacts the epidemic model that I briefly showed you with a model of the economy. And so the blue line shows you what happens without government intervention. And you see infections rising and then falling. You see, the draining of the susceptibles. In the beginning, almost everybody's susceptible, but then, many of these people become infected. You see the recovered and the death toll of the epidemic. Without government intervention, these epidemics extinguish themselves. And the reason is that we were not susceptible. So there's a lot of discussion about herd immunity. And when do you achieve herd immunity? You achieve herd immunity at that peak of infections. You see, Because here we have no government intervention, and when that blue line reaches the peak, well, then we have herd immunity. The number of infected is going to come down, and maybe governments will take credit, but we've done nothing. They just come down automatically. Why do they come down? Because there's not enough susceptibles anymore. There's not enough raw material to keep the infection rising. So that's the point at which we achieve herd immunity. So what's the problem of going for herd immunity as a strategy? Well, you have a lot of people that die. So that's the collateral damage of the herd immunity strategy. So I computed here for you the optimal policy, the optimal containment policy, and that's in the last chart. And you can see the containment rate, the optimal one, is quite high in the beginning, rises as infections go up. And then as infections come back down, as the number of infected people come back down, you reduce the containment rate. So that's kind of the best you can do. So why is it that you start with a very high rate of containment, even though in the beginning you have a very small number of infections? And the reason is that the model takes into account that a vaccine might be in the works. And if you have a vaccine in the works, you want to prevent people from getting infected before the vaccine arrives. So most vaccines do not help people that have already been infected. And here is my other personal connection with these episodes. When I was a little child, I used to play with a little girl called Lolita. I'm from Portugal. She had a very Spanish name because her mother is Spanish. And she was 3 years older than I, and this difference made a huge difference in the way in which we lived our lives. Because when I was a child, I was vaccinated against polio. But Lolita, when she was born, there was no polio vaccine that was available, and she contracted polio. And she's still living with polio today. So that's what you want to avoid. See, you want to avoid people becoming infected, before the vaccine arrives. And this is why you start with high containment, you ratchet up, and then you bring it down as infections come down. Now, take a look at the blue line for infections and then the dashed dark line. So the dashed dark line is under optimal government policy. And you can see policy does one thing. It reduces the number of infected people at the peak. It delays the number of infections. And of course, it greatly reduces the death toll of the epidemic. So you can see, if you look at the chart for deaths, that we have a much smaller death toll than without government intervention. However, you see in the next graph, the graph next to it, that now in the previous slide, we're still in the previous slide. So what you see is that there's a huge recession, which is there's a recession anyway. So the blue line shows you that there's a recession because people don't want to go out to restaurants, they don't want to go out to sports events or to the theater. And so even if the government does not intervene, you can see in the blue line that shows you a recession. But then when the government intervenes, that recession is exacerbated. And so this is the choice that was given to governments. You see a very tough choice. So here's the choice. It says, you do nothing, you kill a lot of people. You want to kill fewer people, you have to kill the economy. So this is really a really tough choice. So could you do better? So let's look at the next slide, what countries in Asia did. They use what we call smart containment. And smart containment, again, the blue line is no government intervention. Smart containment is the red line. So what do? We're going to test, and here in this simulation, we're going to test 2% of the population in the first week. Then we're going to add 2% of the population every week. People get tested until they either recover or they pass away. So if I'm in the testing pool, I'll continue to be tested until I'm either recover or I pass away from the disease, unfortunately, right? And every week we're going to add 2% of the population to the testing pool. So why are we testing? Because if the people that are infected, there's so many people that are infected but are asymptomatic, those people are quarantined. And what you see here is that the red line is the economy under this smart containment. What you see is a smaller recession. If you look at the graph for consumption, a much smaller recession, and you can see a much smaller death toll. So smart containment is win-win. You see, the economy does better because there's less risk of infections. People are more willing to go to restaurants. They are more willing to travel. So the economy does not suffer as much. But because you're removing the infected people, or many of them, from circulation, you are also reducing the death toll. And this is what countries in Asia, countries like South Korea or Taiwan, implemented. But unfortunately, that we in the West were not prepared to implement.
So Sergio, how do epidemics end?
Right. So let's talk about the end, because it's what we're all looking for. So if we can look at the next slide. So one possible ending is that the virus mutates and becomes less lethal. And you might be thinking, why would the virus do that? Well, if you think about it a little bit, it might be in the evolutionary interest of the virus to become less lethal. Viruses need hosts to stay alive. And the virus that's very lethal kills the host very quickly and does not have the chance to propagate. So this is a possibility, but the bad news is that it's not happening. However, I want to show you what's happening in terms of mutations of the virus, because there's some good news in that data. So perhaps we can take a look at that chart for mutations. I hope I'm not going to scare you now, but these are all the mutations that have occurred up to yesterday. And what you see here is there's a bunch of mutations, but then you see horizontal lines. So what does that mean? The virus mutates 2 or 3 times and then it becomes stable. See, the virus is doing very well. And so it does not feel the need to mutate anymore. These horizontal lines are great news because they mean that we are likely to be able to develop a vaccine against the virus. If I show you a chart for this for HIV/AIDS, what you see is the lines just keep going and there's no horizontal lines. And that's why we don't have a vaccine for HIV. If a vaccine works for the characteristics of the virus this week, in a few weeks, the virus has mutated so much, the vaccine no longer works. This is a virus that has stabilized. That's what you see in all these horizontal lines. And that's why we are hopeful that a vaccine will work. So let's take a look at other possible endings in the next slide. So obviously we are all hoping that an effective treatment, that if you could take a pill that would negate all the effects of the virus, that would be fantastic. That would put an end to the epidemic. That still hasn't happened, although we have much better treatments now than in the beginning. And of course, a vaccine, effective vaccine will be fantastic. But we have to be prepared for the possibility that sometimes vaccines don't work and sometimes 100% effective treatments do not arrive. And so in that case, what's the exit? Well, it's herd immunity, right? We're going to go towards herd immunity. So in the next chart, I want to share with you a quick calculation that I did to see how close are we to herd immunity. And I did it for New York City, which was a place in the United States that was really very badly battered by the epidemic. And 24,000 people died in New York. So I did a quick calculation. So first I computed death mortality rates per age. I used data from South Korea because they did a lot of random testing. So this is the best data we have. So I have mortality from the virus per age, and then I interacted that with the distribution of people by age in New York. I came up with a number of 0.8. If you know the mortality rate and you know how many people died, you can back out how many people were infected in total. And so I did that calculation for New York. The number is 3 million, and that's 35% of the New York City population. How close are we to herd immunity? You probably need about 60% of the population that has been exposed to the virus. So in one sense, we are near, right? We are 25% away, but in another sense, to get there, you would kill a lot more people. So that's the sense in which herd immunity is a very, very tough strategy.
So Sergio, what's driving the second waves that we're seeing now?
Yeah, so great question. So let's talk about second waves. Let me show you in the next chart what's happening here in Illinois, where I'm seeing. So in the next slide, we're going to take a look at the death toll first in New York, which, as you can see, it's off the charts. So New York is closer to herd immunity if the cost was very big. You can see in Illinois, thankfully, we've done a lot better in terms of the death toll. But what it shows to you, and this is what you see happening throughout the United States, but also you see it happening in many other countries, in Europe in particular, is we see containment rates go down. So we have less containment than we had in March, April, and May. And so this is the ruthless logic of the mathematics of the epidemics, right? You just saw if there's more meetings between susceptibles and infected, there's more infections, and the infections rates rise and the death toll rises. So you can see the purple line shows you what will happen in Illinois if we release containment by 50%, if we go back to 50% towards the normal, and you see a second wave. As we release containment throughout the world and throughout different regions of the United States, we are now battling these second waves, which are quite unavoidable.
So Sergio, can you talk about the impact on the economy?
Right. So let's turn to the economy, and let me show you in the next chart the growth rate of real GDP. Again, I never expected to see something like this. Again, the Great Recession was the biggest recession in the post-war era. But you can see in the last quarter, that second quarter of 2020 will be remembered forever, because we had a growth rate of -9% on a year-on-year basis. That's just gigantic. As you can see, it's completely off the charts. Now, I want to show you the trend, what is happening in terms of trends in the next graph. And that U.S. economy used to go at 2.7% per year. So that's 2% per capita income growth and 0.7% population growth. What you see here is the forecasters have already downgraded, and now they think the US only grows at 2.1%. So we are having a lower standard. But you can also see in this chart that after the Great Recession, we never got back to trend. We never did. You see, kind of we came down 5%, then the economy recovered. But usually after a recession, you go back to trend. There's a few quarters where you grow at 4 or 5%. We never had that bump up. And you can see we were now way down. And we'll probably never, ever go back to that trend. So these recessions have been quite damaging to the economy, and no place is that felt more harshly than in the labor market. So if we can take a look at unemployment claims in the next chart, again, look at the Great Recession. So that's kind of in the beginning of the graph. I mean, that now looks like a picnic. It looks nothing special. It was very scary as we were going through it. Remember, we got together here at Marsh several times in several events, and it was quite worrisome. But take a look at what's happening now. I mean, 7 million people registered for unemployment in a single week. I mean, we are living in a world where the media is reporting, oh, unemployment claims less than 1 million this week. How great that is. I mean, good times are back. So it's a really strange world. Now let's look at the stock market. And one of the surprises is that the quick recovery of stocks. But I want to comment on the fact that when you look at the S&P 500, the S&P 500 is now a pool of a very diverse set of companies. And actually, the companies that have pulled the S&P 500 to do so well after first declining are the tech companies and other large companies in the United States. Actually, if you exclude those companies, the index is still significantly down for the year. So we're seeing a tremendous divergence between tech companies that have done quite well and non-tech companies, the rest of the economy. Oil prices, which I'm going to show you in the next chart, another surprise, they became negative for 2 weeks. Again, we don't have much place to store oil, and very, very quickly demand came down 40%. So there was no time to adjust the oil supply. There was also disagreement, as you know, among oil producers who should cut the most, and so it took a while for supply to adjust to demand, and so we had this strange 2 weeks with negative oil prices.
So, Sergio, can you talk about the actions of the Fed and the prospects for interest rates?
Right. So one of the ironies of the current episode is that if we had not had the Great Recession, we would now be battling a financial crisis as well as an epidemic. But the Fed got its training during the Great Recession. There are all these facilities, all these programs, namely quantitative easing, buying long-term government bonds, buying mortgages, and the Fed started doing. So let me show you the balance sheet of the Fed. When Ben Bernanke became chair a long time ago, the balance sheet of the Fed was $800 billion. You see that in the beginning of the sample. During the financial crisis, the balance sheet blew up to $4.5 trillion. And you can see the amazingly fast action of the Fed. Without hesitation, they brought the balance sheet to $7 trillion. And that meant we had very little signs of financial distress during the current episode, because the interest rates came down very quickly for across the board. So let's take a look in the next chart at yields on 30-year inflation-adjusted bonds, so the TIPS. And again, something that I did not expect to see was a 30-year bond having yields in the negative territory. So interest rates are low across the board. And there's, of course, part of the reason why the stock market is doing so well. I always like to say that what people really like in this world more than love is a certificate of deposit that yields 7%. People really like high interest rates on safe assets. And when interest rates on safe assets are zero or negative, they feel they have to take risk. And so the money flocks to the stock market. That's part of what's happening. But it also flocks to the real estate market. So as you all know, low interest rates, which are there now, and I agree with Martin's comment in the beginning, they will be there for the next few years. They will provide quite a stimulus to the housing market.
So, Sergio, the consumer behavior is so important in the U.S. economy. How is the consumer reacting to all of this?
Yeah, so let's take a look at the consumer. Perhaps we can start with savings rates in the next chart. And we'll see that the consumer acted in the same way as in the Great Recession, which is increased savings rates during the recession. The consumer feels that things are out of control, and we know that consumers in recessions always want to feel control. And one of the things that every consumer controls is how much money they spend. So you can see them spending less. Now, this is pretty bad news for businesses and that produce goods and services to sell to the consumers, because the consumers are not showing up. You can see in the recent episodes savings and going through the roofs. So let's take a quick look at the high frequency data on employment in the next chart. And what I'm showing you here is that low income earners were much more affected by the epidemic than high income earners. So the blue line is high income earners. There was some decline in employment, but you can see a tremendous decline, about 35% in the employment of low income earners. And that has been quite tough. And then in the next chart, we have a bit of a surprise. If you look at spending, as it turns out, spending of high income earners fell by much more than spending of low income earners. So that is strange, because remember, the high income earners were not as affected in terms of their job market prospects, and yet they really reduced spending. So what is going on? Well, remember, high income people, they spend a lot of money on restaurants, on travel, hospitality, and we, to protect ourselves, stop consuming those goods, greatly reduce consumption of those goods. That had an enormous impact on the employment prospects of people that work in restaurants, people that work in shopping malls, people that work in hospitals, and those industries employ a lot of relatively low-skilled workers. So the fact that high-skilled workers try to protect themselves, as we saw in the model, if you have an epidemic raging, you want to consume fewer high-contact goods and services, but that destroyed a lot of jobs for relatively low-income workers and led to this abnormal pattern here. So in the next chart, let's take a look at how consumer spending has changed. So this is before and after COVID, and you can see, first of all, people consume more food at home. A lot of people learn how to cook. There's a lot of amateur bakers. People are making yogurt. They're also drinking more at home. And that doesn't mean more drinking overall, because people don't go to bars and to restaurants, but you can see alcoholic beverages and an increase in those consumed at home. We are buying fewer clothes because we can have these Zoom sessions in gym clothes. Looks like housing is going up, but remember, expenditure came down, and housing is pretty much a constant. So that's just a mechanical effect. The fact that the weight of housing has increased is just that it's reflecting the drop in expenditure. Medical care has gone down as we stop going to the hospital for normal health care. And actually, the health sector has done pretty poorly in terms of profits during this episode. Much less transportation, as people are not going to work. They are, working remotely, or don't want to take the subway for fear of getting infected. More education and communication, much less food away from home, as restaurants suffered a really hard time. So let's take a look actually at the restaurants in the next slide, and this is open table reservations, and it shows us two important messages. The first is that you see a tremendous drop in reservations before any government intervention in the United States. So even before the government intervened, restaurant reservations had already dropped by 50%. Then the government shut down, brought those reservations to minus 100%. So we had no action in restaurants. You can see as states opened up, you see a recovery, but we're back to about 50% with some volatility. And that shows you that unless we have an end to the epidemic, the economy will not recover fully. So let's talk a little bit about how firms are adapting. in the next slide. So, and I'm sure you all had to do with this, but just to quickly review, firms have implemented multiple layers of security, masks, social distancing, deep sanitation. A lot of companies have instituted temperature and oxygen saturation readings. As I'm sure you know, oxygen levels tend to drop in people that have become newly infected. So it's a way to catch those people at an early point and to quarantine them. Improvements in air circulation for many companies. However, public transportation, there's many companies that put a lot of work trying to improve circulation of air in their factories, but then the workers come through public transportation, through crowded buses or crowded subways, and that has been quite a worry in terms of a source of infection. Vaccinations against the flu and pneumonia, so that the symptoms of COVID and flu are not confused, but also hoping for some cross immunity. Vitamin D supplementation, there's some evidence that it really reduces infection rates, and so some companies made it available to their employees. And then a lot of testing, quarantining, and contact tracing that's been implemented by companies. So let me talk a little bit about permanent changes that come with COVID-19, and one of them is the adoption and acceptance of biometrics going forward. Just like after 9/11, we had to get used to all the security measures. I think, people are going to get used to biometrics and to sensors that try to detect the virus and so forth. Remote work is going to become a permanent part of the employment landscape. We still don't know. I mean, we're not going to go back to the amount of remote work we have now, but certainly it will become part of the mix. And that has two important consequences. One is we have to think about what is going to be the value of those downtown office buildings that large companies use to accommodate their workforce. And will there be a cutback in that? And will that part of the retail market suffer? As we saw, low interest rates are very good for housing, for real estate in general, but they might be very good for housing, but they might not help so much with commercial real estate. The labor market is going to become more global, so that's another trend that's going to come with remote work. Let me say that in general, what the crisis has done is accelerate trends that were already in place. It has not really created new trends, but all of these are trends that were in place and are greatly accelerated. We hear at Kellogg from many companies that their 2030 plan is now being implemented in 2023. So tremendous acceleration. And a place where that acceleration is very visible is in e-commerce. You see all the e-commerce companies doing very, very well. Again, that has accelerated the demise of conventional retail, making it really hard for people that have large investments in shopping malls. Telemedicine, which was not accepted before, and there were regulatory barriers to it, has become widely embraced. And in the next slide, we have the bigger role of the government. Governments around the world have become investors and insurers of last resort. And we're going to end the crisis with bigger governments. And one side effect of that is that there'll be more lobbying, there'll be more special interests trying to get things from the government because the government has now a bigger pool of resources. We're seeing some automation and reshoring. We're seeing companies worried about having their supply chain so spread out throughout the world. And we're seeing much higher income inequality, as you saw the low-income people being the most affected by the crisis. So we already started with very high income inequality going into the crisis, and we're going to exit with much higher income inequality, which will make for more populist politics, more divided politics. And finally, we're going to see a larger role of Asia. Asia was already gaining importance in the world. It has for many years, but that acceleration has been associated with the crisis. So in the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about the idea of building social capital with customers and employees. We heard Martin talk about what Marsh put in place, which was quite impressive. And I want to tell you a little story about the Madeira Island. I'm from Portugal, and Portugal has this tropical island called Madeira, and that's where Madeira wine is produced. I really, if you haven't tried it, I really urge you to try it. In fact, I want to say I've been conducting a little bit of a clinical trial here at home. And just me and my family, and we drink a glass of Madeira every day, and it has worked very well. We feel good. I mean, the control group is the neighbors, and again, I don't want to, emphasize this point, but they don't look as good as we do, as far as we can tell, because they are not drinking Madeira wine. So I think it has been quite productive. John Adams famously said that a glass of Madeira can make anyone feel like they could be president. But the story I want to tell you is a few years back in this Madeira Island, there was a very tough earthquake, and the water supply became disrupted. It was dangerous to drink water from the tap. There were two supermarkets on the island, Supermarket A and Supermarket B. And Supermarket A did the normal business thing. They thought, well, there's a lot of demand for bottled water. The supply is limited. We got to raise the price of bottled water. So they raised the price of bottled water. Supermarket B, they kept the price of bottled water the same. And they actually freighted a boat to come from Lisbon in a way that made no sense for them from a short-term business perspective. But they freighted a boat to bring lots of bottled water so they could restock the shelves, and they kept the price always the same. Well, Supermarket A, the supermarket that raised prices of water during the crisis, no longer exists. Because people said, I bought it, I shopped in this supermarket for all these years, and at a time of crisis, they decided that I was a profit center. They were going to profiteer from me. So, we show. A lot of companies put a lot of effort into building an eloquent brand voice and tell customers, what their brand values are and so forth. But we show what we are really about in times of crisis. So let's take a look at the next slide, which just speaks to the fact that we don't remember most of our lives. I hope you remember something from this presentation, but we remember 0.05% of our lives. Most of it gone, but we remember the highs and we remember the lows. And we remember how we were treated during the lows. So when you're running a company, this is a moment of need. So being there for your employees, being there for your customers, reaching out. And I've heard from Jeff, that this is a lot of what Marsh has been doing. And that is the right thing to do. And that is going to do better things for you than any marketing campaign you could put together, because what you showed what you really are about building a community with your clients, building a community with your employees, and making sure we all end this difficult period in a better place. So let me urge you to reach out to your friends. And many things have changed with COVID-19, but one thing that has not changed is how great it is to drink a glass of wine with friends, and if it's a glass of Madeira wine, even better. So let me stop here. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, so Sergio, that was very insightful, and thanks for sharing your insights on the economy. One of the questions that is coming in, we have a live feed coming in with a series of different questions about the upcoming election and the impact on the economy. Your thoughts, Sergio?
Sure. I'm not going to tell you how to vote, but I think the thing that's important to emphasize about the election, the U.S. economy has thrived because of the amazing agility of the private sector, and so it has thrived under many different presidents and many different policies. But what's bad for the economy is uncertainty. And what we're seeing at the moment is uncertainty related to COVID and enhanced by the election. And that means companies just put their investment plans on hold. And when they are on hold, you don't create new jobs, you don't renew the manufacturing capacity, the production capacity of the economy. So I think the best thing we can get out of the election is, first of all, a clear winner that's not going to prolong the uncertainty, and the uncertainty being resolved. That alone will do a lot to help the economy revive.